Dear listeners, are you ready for an electrifying detective tale that will keep you on the edge of your seat? Presenting The Shadows of Blackmore Manor, the case is in the brilliant hands of none other than the legendary detective, Lucian Drake. Hidden within the eerie corridors of Blackmore Manor lies a sinister mystery, one that whispers secrets of betrayal, deception, and an unsolved disappearance that has haunted London's elite for decades. Just as ancient myths speak of cursed relics, this case is shrouded in darkness, where every clue deepens the enigma, and every suspect has a hidden agenda. As Lucian Drake delves into the case, he finds himself entangled in a web of lies, where the truth is as elusive as the moon's reflection on a stormy sea. The telephone rang. "Drake? Are you there?" Lucian Drake instantly recognized the voice. It was that of Inspector Alden Graves, a seasoned officer with a reputation for tackling the city's most baffling crimes. There was something unsettling in his tone, a rare hesitation that sent a ripple of unease through the detective's sharp mind. "I wouldn't call at this hour unless it was urgent," the inspector continued, his voice edged with tension. "I need you at Blackmore Manor, now." Drake's fingers tightened around the receiver. He had heard of Blackmore Manor, an estate whispered about in hushed tones, infamous for the strange occurrences that plagued it. "I'm on my way," he said without hesitation, already reaching for his coat. The night outside was thick with fog, curling through the streets like ghostly tendrils. He could sense it. This was no ordinary case. Something sinister awaited him beyond those ancient gates, something that would test the limits of his deduction and uncover a truth darker than he had ever faced before. "I'm on my way," Lucian Drake replied, slipping his coat over his shoulders. The night air was thick with mist as he made his way down the deserted Blackmore Lane, his sharp eyes scanning the dimly lit numbers on the doors. It was well past midnight, and the entire street lay wrapped in an eerie silence, save for the occasional flickering of a gas lamp or the distant sound of a carriage rattling over cobblestones. A single cat darted across the alley, its shadow stretching unnaturally long under the moonlight. The deeper he ventured, the more he felt the unsettling weight of something unseen lurking in the darkness. At last he reached number 7. Before he could knock, the door creaked open just enough to reveal Inspector Alden Graves' rigid expression. "Good timing," he muttered. "Come in, quickly." Inside, a steep, narrow staircase led up to a dimly lit chamber. The moment Drake stepped in, the heavy scent of stale cigar smoke and spilt brandy hit his nostrils. The room was a scene of utter chaos, furniture overturned, shards of glass glinting on the carpet, half-smoked cigarettes crushed into expensive rugs, and velvet drapes left swaying as if disturbed only moments ago. The remains of an extravagant evening lay scattered everywhere: crumpled napkins, lipstick-stained glasses, and a discarded silk scarf that looked too elegant to have been left behind carelessly. Drake's sharp gaze swept over the details. "A party," he murmured, his voice laced with knowing amusement. "And not just any party, one that ended rather unpleasantly." "That's putting it mildly," Graves said grimly. "This place belongs to Eleanor Cavendish, Mrs. Eleanor Cavendish." Drake raised an eyebrow. "The Eleanor Cavendish, the one with a reputation for hosting the most decadent gatherings in London's underbelly." "The very same," Graves confirmed, "and tonight something went terribly wrong." Drake knelt beside an upturned chair, running his fingers along its broken leg. A faint, dark stain marred the fine wood. Blood, fresh. He straightened, his keen mind already whirring through possibilities. "Tell me everything," he said, eyes gleaming with intrigue. "She's been through more than just a few lovers," Graves muttered, lighting a cigarette with a flick of his wrist. "Eleanor Cavendish knows how to play the game. A widow twice over, and now tangled up with a man half her age, one she's convinced is looking for an escape route." Drake listened intently, his sharp gaze sweeping across the room, taking in every shattered glass and discarded cigarette, as if they whispered secrets only he could hear. The air was heavy with the lingering scent of whiskey, and something far more illicit. They started the evening with champagne, and ended it with something far stronger. Graves continued grimly. "Cocaine, the real unfiltered poison. First it lifts you up, makes you feel invincible, as if the world is spinning in your favor, but take too much, and you slip into madness, paranoia, hysteria, violence." He exhaled a thin stream of smoke, his voice tightening, and Eleanor was already on edge. Drake arched an eyebrow. "Let me guess." She confronted her lover. Graves nodded. "A man named Victor Hawthorne, smooth talker, dangerous smile, the kind that slips away like a shadow when trouble comes knocking." She accused him of planning to leave her, and in a room full of intoxicated onlookers, they had a fight that could have torn the walls down. He walked out, slamming the door behind him. But Eleanor wasn't finished. Drake's fingers traced the edge of an overturned crystal glass, his mind piecing the scene together. She had a gun. A brand new revolver, Graves confirmed, his expression darkening. Someone foolish enough to impress her had gifted it to her that very night. She leaned out of that very window, raised her shaking hands and fired. Drake turned toward the large window, the city lights flickering beyond the fog. Did she hit him? Not even close, Graves said with a smile. The bullet went wide by a long shot. But fate has a twisted sense of humor. You see, there was a man in the alley below, a vagrant digging through the bins for scraps. Poor devil never saw it coming. Drake's jaw tightened. She shot him. Through the arm. A nasty wound, but not fatal. The shot sent the whole street into chaos. People rushed to drag him inside before anyone started asking too many questions. By the time I got here, there was more blood on the floor than common sense in the room. They were terrified, worried the whole thing would turn into a scandal. Drake let out a slow breath, stepping over to a dark stain on the floor where the man had likely bled out before being patched up. And the victim? Graves smoked. Once he realized he wasn't dying, he saw an opportunity. A few well-placed words, a couple of £5 notes slid into his pocket, and suddenly he wasn't so keen on talking to the authorities. Just like that, the problem disappeared. Drake stared at him for a moment before turning back to the room, eyes gleaming with intrigue. Oh, but problems like these never truly disappear. They just wait, in the shadows. And you? Drake's voice was calm, but his piercing gaze missed nothing. Graves ran a hand through his disheveled hair, exhaling sharply. I had my hands full. Eleanor was in complete hysteria by then, screaming, sobbing, cursing Hawthorne's name like a woman possessed. Her hands were shaking so badly, I thought she might grab the revolver again, and do something even more foolish. I had no choice but to sedate her, gave her a shot of something strong and packed her off to bed before she could cause more damage. Drake folded his arms, his eyes narrowing slightly, and she was the only one left. Graves let out a humorless chuckle. Not quite. There was another girl, young, barely past 20 I'd say. She was completely out of it. Found her slumped against the divan, her breathing shallow, pupils dilated. It wasn't just alcohol. No, this was something else, something stronger. I had to work fast to stabilize her before she slipped too far under. That kind of recklessness. He shook his head. It's deadly. Drake stepped further into the dimly lit room, the remnants of excess and indulgence still scattered across every surface. And what of the others? They scattered the moment things took a turn. Graves said bitterly. No one wanted to be here when the dust settled. The air reeked of fear, not just the usual guilt of a drunken night gone wrong, but something deeper. They knew what had been flowing through their veins tonight, and they knew the consequences if the wrong people got wind of it. Drake ran a gloved finger over a silver tray, its surface smudged with fine, powdery residue. His jaw tightened. This wasn't just an evening of indulgence, it was a transaction, a gathering of people who thought they were untouchable, playing with poison. Graves exhaled sharply. That's what I realized too. If it had been just another drunken mess, I would have walked away and left them to their regrets. But this, dope changes everything. People start asking questions, and answers are never simple. Drake looked up, his sharp, calculating mind already working ahead. And you're certain of what you saw? Graves' expression was grim. No doubt about it. This wasn't a one-time mistake. This was planned, and the people involved, they're dangerous, Drake. If you dig too deep, you might not like what you find. Drake smiled faintly, the kind of smile that sent a chill through even the most hardened criminals. Then I suppose we should start digging. Drake studied the room carefully, his sharp gaze locking onto a small lacquered box half hidden beneath a pile of crushed cigarette butts. He crouched, picking it up delicately, then flicked it open with his thumb. Inside, a fine crystalline powder clung to the edges, white, potent, unmistakable. He exhaled slowly. Cocaine, he murmured. No question about it. They don't just dabble in this, they indulge. This wasn't a night of reckless fun, it was routine, a system, and the real question isn't who used it. His fingers tapped the edge of the box thoughtfully. It's where it came from. Graves shifted on his feet, his expression clouded. That's what got me thinking. You mentioned just the other day about how there's been a sudden surge in the supply, a new network pushing the stuff, more users, more overdoses, and whoever's behind it, they're getting bolder. Drake's eyes darkened, which means the police will want to hear about tonight. Graves let out a breath, his hesitation palpable. That's just it. Drake's gaze sharpened, his instincts prickling. You don't sound too eager to involve them. Graves hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. It's just innocent people get caught in the crossfire. It's not fair to them. Drake arched a brow. Innocent? I doubt Mrs. Eleanor Cavendish falls into that category. Graves let out a short, humorless laugh. Eleanor? Hell no. She's cold as steel. She knew exactly what she was doing when she started this mess. Drake tilted his head slightly, watching him carefully. Then it's the other one, the girl. Graves' silence spoke volumes. His jaw tightened, and he looked away, as if wrestling with something unspoken. Drake's voice dropped to a near whisper. She's in trouble, isn't she? Graves finally sighed, running a hand down his face. She doesn't belong in this world, Drake. She was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And if the police get involved, they won't see the difference. They never do. Drake's lips pressed into a thin line. He had seen it too many times before. A system that didn't care for nuance. A machine that swallowed people whole, regardless of whether they were victims or villains. Then we do this carefully, he said at last. We find out who's really pulling the strings before the authorities get their hands on her, because if we don't... He shut the lacquered box with a snap. She won't stand a chance. Graves hesitated, his fingers drumming against the table's edge. His expression wavered between frustration and something else, something almost protective. Look, she plays tough, acts like none of this matters, but that's just a front. She's young, reckless, yeah, but it's all an act. She thinks running with these people makes her smarter, sharper, untouchable, but she doesn't see the danger. Not really. Drake studied him. The room was still a mess, empty glasses, reflecting the dim light, crumpled napkins strewn across the floor, the scent of expensive perfume mixed with the lingering bitterness of burnt cigarettes. He let the silence stretch before speaking, his voice measured. This girl, you knew her before tonight, didn't you? Graves' jaw tensed, his eyes darted away for a moment before he nodded. Mertonshire, Hunt Ball, a different world from this mess. He let out a breath, as if he could still hear the distant sound of violins, laughter ringing through the grand halls. Her father's a retired general, the kind that lives by iron discipline, expects everyone else to do the same. Old war stories, strict rules, no nonsense. But his daughters... He huffed out a short laugh, shaking his head. 4 of them, all wild. Can you blame them? Growing up under a man like that, nothing but rules and expectations, it makes you want to run, makes you want to rebel. Drake listened, his fingers tracing the rim of a glass absent-mindedly, and she ran straight into the wrong crowd. Graves' nod was slow. That part of the county. It's not like it used to be. The old country estates, the traditions, they're fading. Now it's all armament factories, money pouring in from the wrong places. New money, no loyalty, no limits. The people there, they don't play by the old rules. They take what they want, destroy whoever gets in their way, and she's in the middle of it. Drake's gaze sharpened. He could hear what Graves wasn't saying, the weight behind his words. You care about her. Graves flinched. I just don't want to see her end up like the others. Used up, discarded. These people chew you up, Drake, and when they're done... His voice dropped, roughened with quiet anger. They don't even bother to bury the bones. Drake studied him for a long moment before finally nodding. Now I see why you called me. You want me to take this matter into my hands. Drake's voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable sharpness in his gaze. Graves hesitated, his fingers tightening into fists before he let out a slow breath. "Would you? I feel like I have to do something, but," he paused, rubbing the back of his neck, "I'd rather keep Sheila Grant out of the public eye if possible." Drake tilted his head slightly, studying him. "That can be arranged, I believe. But first I must see this young lady." Graves nodded, motioning for Drake to follow him out of the dimly lit sitting room. The corridor was narrow, lined with peeling wallpaper, the air thick with the lingering scent of perfume, stale smoke, and something darker, sickness, desperation. Suddenly a voice cracked through the silence, raw and frantic. "Doctor, for God's sake, doctor, I'm going crazy." The door opposite them swung up, and a woman's gaunt face emerged, her makeup smudged, her eyes bloodshot with wild desperation. Graves was already at her bedside, his tone professional, controlled. "It's all right, just breathe. You're safe." Drake stood in the doorway, observing the scene. The room was a disaster, powder spilled in haphazard streaks across the dresser, bottles knocked over, clothes tossed carelessly across the floor. The woman on the bed clawed at her own skin, her fingers trembling. "They're crawling all over me," she shrieked, eyes darting frantically around the room. "I swear to God they are. I can feel them under my skin." Graves' voice was steady as he reached for his medical bag, pulling out a syringe. "You need to rest. I'll take care of you." Drake, silent, stepped back into the hall. This was not his concern. His concern lay beyond this door. Across from him another door stood slightly ajar. Without hesitation, he pushed it open. The air inside was different, calmer, quieter, a stark contrast to the chaos he had just left behind. The room was small, plain, no gaudy decorations, no reckless luxury, just a narrow bed, a simple dresser, and a chair. On the bed a girl lay still, her figure delicate in the dim light. Drake moved closer, his steps careful, controlled. As he reached the side of the bed, he could see her clearly now, dark hair cascading over the pillow, a face pale as porcelain, then a flicker, a slight movement, a breath. Her eyes opened, large, dark, startled. For a moment there was nothing but silence. Then instinctively, she pushed herself up, her hair falling forward as she did, her fingers gripping the blanket, as if to steady herself. Drake didn't move. Sheila Grant had woken up, and the fear in her eyes told him everything he needed to know. This was just the beginning. She looked like a frightened filly, her entire body tensed, her breath shallow, her eyes darting towards the door as if she were ready to bolt at the slightest movement. There was something raw in her expression, the way a wild animal hesitates, unsure whether to flee, or to trust the hand that offers it food. Then her voice cut through the heavy silence, thin, abrupt, defensive. "Who the hell are you?" Drake remained still, his expression unreadable. "Do not be afraid, mademoiselle." His voice was calm, measured. Her fingers curled into the thin blanket, draped over her. "Where's Dr. Stoddart?" The door creaked as it swung open behind them, and relief flooded her face as soon as she saw him. "Oh, there you are. Who's this?" Stoddart approached the bed, his tone gentle but firm. "This is a friend of mine, Sheila. How are you feeling now?" She sank back slightly, her expression softening, but exhaustion clung to her features. "Awful, lousy." She let out a breath, shaking her head. "Why did I take that foul stuff?" Stoddart crossed his arms, his voice dry. "I wouldn't do it again if I were you." Sheila hesitated, then muttered, I shan't." Drake took a step closer, watching her carefully. "Who gave it to you?" The question made her freeze for the briefest moment. A flicker of something crossed her face. Fear? Hesitation. Her lips parted slightly, but she hesitated. "It was here, at the party. We all tried it. It was wonderful at first." Drake didn't blink. "But who brought it here?" Her fingers clenched into the sheets, her breathing uneven. "I don't know. It might have been Tony Hawker, but I don't really know anything about it." Drake's gaze remained locked on her, searching for cracks in her words. "Is it the first time you have taken cocaine, mademoiselle?" A slow nod. Stoddart's patience wore thin. His voice hardened. "You'd better make it the last." Sheila's lips parted, then shut again. She looked down, guilt flickering across her pale face. "Yes, I suppose so. but it was rather marvelous. Stoddart's expression darkened, and his voice took on a new edge. Now listen to me, Sheila Grant. He leaned forward, his words sharp and unyielding. I'm a doctor. I've seen what this leads to. You start this drug-taking racket, and you won't even recognize yourself a year from now. It will eat away at you, body and soul. You think it's thrilling now. You think it's harmless fun. I've watched people turn into something less than human, shadows of themselves. Alcohol's a picnic compared to this poison. If you have any sense left, cut it out. From this minute, Sheila swallowed, her throat tightening. Something about his words struck deep. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. She nodded, slowly, hesitantly, but the fear in her eyes remained, because deep down, she already knew, this wasn't over, this was just the beginning. Believe me, it isn't funny. Stoddart's voice was sharp, his patience running thin. What do you think your father would say about tonight's business? Sheila Grant stiffened, her expression flickering with something between defiance and fear. Then suddenly, she threw back her head, and let out a brittle, almost hysterical laugh. Father, she gasped, shaking her head as though the very idea was absurd. Father, her laughter grew, raw and unhinged, echoing through the small room. I can just see his face. He mustn't know about it. He'd have 7 fits. And quite right too, Stoddart muttered grimly. Before he could say more, a shrill, wailing voice sliced through the air from the next room. Doctor, doctor, the long drawn-out cry of Mrs. Grace. Stoddart clenched his jaw, muttering something uncomplimentary under his breath. Without another word, he turned on his heel and disappeared through the door. Sheila remained where she was, her breath uneven. The manic laughter had drained from her, leaving behind only an uncertain wariness. Her gaze flickered back to Poirot, her brows knitting together in suspicion. "Who are you, really?" she asked, her voice quieter now, more cautious. "You weren't at the party." Poirot inclined his head slightly. "No, mademoiselle, I was not." She studied him, her eyes narrowing. "You're a friend of Dr. Stoddart's." "Yes." A pause. "You're a doctor too," she ventured. Then, with an edge of skepticism, "You don't look like a doctor." Poirot allowed himself a small smile. He straightened slightly, his voice taking on that deliberate, almost theatrical weight that so often preceded the unraveling of a mystery. "My name," he said, with quiet precision, "is Hercule Poirot." The effect was immediate. For a fleeting second, Sheila's face remained blank, as if her mind needed a moment to catch up with what she had just heard. Then recognition dawned. Her breath hitched, her eyes widened, and all traces of defiance melted into stunned disbelief. "Hercule Poirot," she repeated, almost whispering. Occasionally, Poirot was disappointed to find that the younger generation had little knowledge of his reputation, but Sheila Grant was not among them. She stared, mouth slightly parted, utterly dumbfounded. He watched her reaction with mild amusement. Recognition was always useful. It made people tread more carefully, and careful people were often the easiest to unravel. Later, in the quiet comfort of a well-furnished drawing room, miles away from the chaotic scene of the party, Poirot sat, sipping tea from a delicate china cup. His hostess, a lady of refined years and an unquenchable thirst for local gossip, leaned forward, her voice laced with the thrill of knowing things others did not. "The Grants," she said, eyes gleaming. "Oh yes, there are 4 of them. A rather spirited bunch, if you ask me." Poirot listened with interest, though he knew it would take patience. This woman would talk about 100 people before she got to the ones he was actually interested in. But patience, he reminded himself, was a virtue. And if there was one thing he had learned, it was that in the world of secrets and lies, the smallest, most inconspicuous details often held the key to everything. 4 daughters, can you imagine? Lady Carmichael threw up her hands in exasperation, her rings catching the light. The poor general doesn't stand a chance. What can a man do with 4 girls? Poirot, ever the listener, gave a small knowing nod. What indeed? Lady Carmichael barely needed encouragement to continue. He was quite the disciplinarian in his regiment, or so he tells everyone. But those girls, oh, they defeat him entirely. It's not like it was in my day, I tell you. Why, I remember poor Colonel Sandys. He was such a martinet that his daughters, she launched into a long meandering tale of the Sandys girls and various other unfortunate young women of her youth, none of whom seemed particularly relevant to the present conversation. Poirot, with his practiced patience, waited for her to circle back, and as always she did. Now mind you, she said, adjusting a pearl earring, I don't mean to suggest there's anything truly scandalous about the Grant girls, just high spirits, that's all. But they do keep rather questionable company. It's not like it used to be around here. The wrong sort of people come down nowadays. This place used to be proper county, you know. Now it's all about money, new money, and that's never the same, is it? Poirot's silence was enough to prompt further revelations, and then of course there are the parties. Oh, you do hear the oddest stories. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. Anthony Hawker, did you say? Oh yes, I know him. Not the sort I'd have at my dinner table, but he's rolling in money, or so they say. He comes down to hunt, throws lavish parties, peculiar ones too, if half of what I hear is true. She paused dramatically, watching Poirot for a reaction. He merely arched an eyebrow. Not that I believe everything people say, she continued, waving a hand, because you know how ill-natured they can be. Always assuming the worst. These days, it's almost fashionable to accuse someone of drinking too much, or worse, taking drugs. Just the other day, someone told me that young girls are naturally inclined to be inebriates. Can you imagine? I thought that was an absolutely dreadful thing to say. Poirot murmured in agreement. Lady Carmichael, encouraged, pressed on. And if someone is a little vague or dreamy in their manner, well, instantly it's drugs. It's quite unfair, really. They say it about Mrs. Larkin too. Now, I don't particularly like the woman, but I really think it's just absent-mindedness. She's a great friend of your Mr. Hawker, and that, if you ask me, is why she's always going on about the Grant girls. She leaned back, pursing her lips. Says they're man-eaters, if you can believe it. Well, I suppose they do chase after men a bit, but why not? It's only natural at their age, and they are quite the beauties, each one of them. Poirot took the opportunity to interject. Mrs. Larkin. Lady Carmichael tilted her head, regarding him with mild surprise. My dear man, it's no use asking me who she really is. Who is anybody nowadays? She let out a small amused breath. They say she rides well. They say she's well off. Husband was something in the city, dead now, not divorced. She arrived here just after the Grants did. Poirot noted the shift in her tone. There was something just on the edge of revelation. Then suddenly, Lady Carmichael stopped speaking. Her mouth parted slightly. Her eyes widened, as though something had just clicked into place. For the first time in their conversation, she was silent, and that, Poirot knew, was when people revealed the most. Lady Carmichael's sharp eyes glinted with mischief, as she suddenly leaned forward and struck Poirot's knuckles with the blunt edge of a paper cutter. The unexpected sting made him wince, but before he could protest, she let out an excited exclamation. Why, of course, so that's why you're here, you sly, deceitful creature. I insist you tell me everything. Poirot, ever composed, merely adjusted his cuffs. And what, madam, am I to tell you? She raised the paper cutter again in playful menace, but this time Poirot, having learned his lesson, withdrew his hand just in time. Oh, don't play the oyster with me, Hercule Poirot, she chided. I can see your moustaches quivering. You're down here because of a crime. I knew it. And you're pumping me for information. Shameless, absolutely shameless. Now let's see, could it be murder? She paused dramatically, tapping the air with the paper cutter, her mind racing through the village's recent misfortunes. Who's died lately? She mused. Old Louisa Gilmore. Oh, but she was practically fossilized, bless her soul. 85, dropsy. Hardly a suspicious case, wouldn't you say? Poor Leo Staverton broke his neck in the hunting field, but he's still breathing under all that plaster, so it can't be him. What a pity. I do love a good murder. Poirot sighed, but before he could interject, Lady Carmichael carried on, eyes bright with speculation. Perhaps it's not a murder then, a jewel robbery, maybe, but no, I can't recall any lately. So perhaps you're here for a criminal, an escapee, a fugitive lurking in our midst. She gasped suddenly, leaning in. Is it Beryl Larkin? Did she poison her husband? I always said there was something suspicious about the way he died, and now she wanders about like a ghost, all vague and dreamy. It must be remorse. Poirot threw up his hands. Madam, you gallop too fast. Lady Carmichael dismissed his protest with a wave of her hand. Nonsense, Hercule Poirot. You're up to something. I can feel it in my bones. Poirot, ever theatrical, clasped his hands together. Madam, are you well acquainted with the classics? She frowned. The classics? What on earth do they have to do with this? They have everything to do with it. You see, I take inspiration from my great namesake, Hercules. One of his famed 12 labors was the taming of the wild horses of DIOMEDES. Lady Carmichael let out a laugh, loud and unrestrained. Oh my dear man, don't tell me you came down here to train horses. At your age, and in those ridiculous patent leather shoes, you don't look like you'd ever so much as sat on a horse in your life. Poirot merely smiled. Madam, appearances can be deceiving. And for the first time Lady Carmichael hesitated. The sparkle in her eyes flickered with something else, a realization perhaps, a shadow of a thought, forming and lingering. Poirot waited, because silence, as he well knew, was when the truth often revealed itself. The horses, madam, are symbolic. Poirot explained, his voice measured and deliberate. They were the wild horses of DIOMEDES, beasts that feasted upon human flesh. Lady Carmichael wrinkled her nose. How very unpleasant of them. I've always thought the ancient Greeks and Romans had such distasteful habits. All that debauchery, those tragic love affairs, and statues with no clothes on. It's a wonder clergymen adore quoting from them. Seems rather hypocritical, don't you think? They frown if a girl enters church without stockings, yet they admire marble nudes without a blink. She sighed dramatically, then snapped her fingers. Now where was I? I am not quite sure, Poirot murmured. She shot him a sharp look. You wretch, you won't tell me if Mrs. Larkin murdered her husband, will you? Or perhaps Anthony Hawker is the Brighton trunk murderer. Imagine the scandal. Her eyes gleamed with the thrill of speculation, but Poirot's face remained unreadable, his fingers steepled together in perfect patience. Lady Carmichael drummed her fingers on the armrest. Forgery then, that would be deliciously wicked. I did see Mrs. Larkin at the bank the other morning, just cashed a £50 cheque to self, quite a sum to take in cash, don't you think? But wait, no, that's the wrong way round. A forger wouldn't withdraw, she'd be paying in. Oh drat it all, Poirot, if you keep sitting there looking like an owl, I swear I shall throw something at you. Poirot offered a small knowing smile. You must have a little patience, madam. Ashley Lodge stood on the crest of a lonely hill, its once grand facade dulled by time and disrepair. It was not a large house, but it bore the remnants of a past life, a life of order, of discipline, of a man accustomed to command. Its garden sprawled in tangled neglect, vines creeping over broken statues, wild roses strangling the remnants of an old gazebo. The stables, though sturdy, echoed with emptiness. Inside, the house was what an ambitious estate agent might optimistically call fully furnished. In reality, it was a chaotic museum of colonial relics. Cross-legged Buddhas leered from alcoves, their golden faces frozen in knowing smiles. Heavy brass Benares trays cluttered the floors, while processional elephants, carved in dark wood, marched across every available mantelpiece. A lifetime of memories, of distant lands and disciplined battles, all crammed within these four walls. And in the center of it all, General Grant sat ensconced in a tattered armchair, his once imposing frame now subdued by age and injury, his legs swathed in thick bandages, rested upon a footstool, the weight of his injury pressing down on more than just his body. It pressed down on his spirit. His sharp eyes, however, were still those of a soldier, and they flickered with something dangerous the moment he saw Hercule Poirot. A battle was about to begin. Gout, General Grant muttered gruffly, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. His thick fingers drummed against the armrest, his frustration barely restrained. Ever had the gout, Mr. Poirot? Damned nuisance. Makes a fellow hellishly bad-tempered. His voice had the bark of a man used to being obeyed, though there was an unmistakable weariness behind it. The years had worn him down, but the old soldier still lingered beneath the surface, bristling against the frailties of age. He gave a derisive snort. "All my father's fault. Drank port every blasted night of his life, so did his father before him. Now look at me, crippled and cursing like a sailor." He shot Poirot a wry look. "Have a drink, will you? Ring that bell for my fellow." Poirot reached for the bell pull, and moments later, a silent turbaned servant appeared in the doorway. Abdul. His movements were precise, his expression unreadable. The general addressed him with the absent-minded authority of a man who had commanded too long to consider questioning his own power. "Whiskey and soda, and don't be stingy with the measure." Abdul bowed and disappeared as quietly as he had come. When the drink arrived, General Grant wasted no time in pouring a measure so generous that Poirot lifted a hand in mild protest. "Can't join you, I'm afraid," the general said regretfully, staring at the untouched tantalus of liquor with something close to longing. "Dr. Waller says it'll be the death of me. Load of rot. Doctors are all the same. Spoil sports, the lot of them. Take away a man's food, his drink, and leave him with nothing but damned steamed fish." Steamed fish. His voice dripped with contempt. Might as well be dead already. His sudden burst of fury cost him. In his indignation, he shifted his bandaged foot without thinking. A sharp white-hot pain shot through him, and he let out a strangled oath. His face contorted, his hands gripping the chair's arms in a vice-like hold. Poirot remained composed, watching as the general breathed through the pain. "Damn this infernal affliction," the old soldier grumbled once he had recovered enough to speak. "Like a bear with a sore head, that's what I am. My girls give me a wide berth when I'm like this. Not that I blame them." His gruffness softened, if only slightly. He exhaled, shaking his head. "You've met one of 'em, I hear." Poirot nodded. "I have had that pleasure, yes. You have several daughters, do you not?" The general made a sound that was part sigh, part growl. "4. His tone was heavy, almost resigned. "Not a boy among 'em. 4 blinking girls." And in times like these, he trailed off, but there was an unmistakable shadow in his voice, as if the weight of some unspoken worry pressed against his chest. Poirot tilted his head. "They are all very charming, I hear." For a fleeting second, something flickered in the general's eyes, pride perhaps, but also something darker, a hesitation, a thought left unsaid. Then just as quickly it was gone. Outside, the wind stirred the branches, rustling the overgrown garden. Somewhere in the distance, a horse whinnied, a sharp, restless sound. The night had secrets, and Ashley Lodge was keeping them well. "Not too bad. No, not too bad," General Grant muttered, his fingers drumming impatiently against the worn armrest of his chair. His eyes, still sharp despite the years, flickered with something unspoken. "Mind you, I never quite know what they're up to. Girls these days, can't control them. No discipline, no restraint, lax times, too much damned laxity everywhere. What's a man to do? Can't lock 'em up, can I?" He gave a short humorless laugh, but there was a tightness in his jaw. Poirot, ever watchful, did not miss it. "They are quite popular in the neighborhood, I hear." Grant let out a gruff chuckle. "Popular? Oh, some are fond of them, but not all. A good deal of mutton dressed as lamb around here. Poirot, women who should know better, prancing about like debutantes. A man's got to be careful." His voice took on a conspiratorial tone, his thick fingers tapping the side of his nose knowingly. "One of these blue-eyed widows nearly had me snared, kept showing up, all softness and sympathy. Poor General Grant, you must have had such an interesting life." Too obvious, Poirot, too obvious by half." He poured himself another measure of whiskey, though he did not drink. Instead he stared at it, as though weighing something far heavier than mere liquor. "Oh well," he sighed, shaking his head. "This place isn't so bad. Bit too modern for my taste. Too much racket motoring everywhere, jazz music blaring, and that damned infernal radio. Won't have one in my house, and the girls know it. A man's got a right to some peace under his own roof." Poirot watched him for a moment before smoothly steering the conversation toward his true purpose. "Anthony Hawker," he said casually. "You know him?" Grant frowned. Hawker, never heard of him." "Wait, Yes, I have. Nasty-looking fellow, eyes too close together. Never trust a man who won't look you straight in the face. Poirot nodded, his gaze unreadable. He is, I believe, a friend of your daughter Sheila's. There was a pause, a flicker of something in the old soldier's eyes. Surprise, then irritation. His bushy eyebrows drew down like storm clouds over his nose. Sheila wasn't aware of it. My daughters never tell me anything. And then his piercing ice-blue eyes locked onto Poirot's with sudden intensity. The jovial bluster was gone. In its place was the sharp, assessing gaze of a man who had once commanded troops, who had once navigated battlefields, where silence could mean survival. "Look here, Poirot," he said, his voice quieter now, but far more dangerous. "What exactly is this about? Mind telling me why you've come?" Poirot leaned forward, his own expression unreadable. His voice when he spoke was measured, deliberate. "That would be difficult to explain. Perhaps I do not yet know myself. But I will say this, General Grant, your daughter Sheila, perhaps all your daughters, have made some questionable acquaintances." The silence that followed was thick, stretching between them like a taut wire. Outside the wind had picked up. A branch scraped against the window like fingernails on glass. Poirot did not blink, and neither did General Grant. "Got into a bad set, have they? I was afraid of that." One hears a word dropped here and there. General Grant's voice was gruff, but beneath the surface, there was something raw, something unspoken. His fingers curled restlessly over the armrest of his chair, as if grasping at answers that refused to materialize. His blue eyes, usually keen and commanding, had dimmed with worry. He turned them toward Poirot, searching, pleading. "But what am I to do, Mr. Poirot? What the devil am I to do?" Poirot studied him for a moment, his fingers lightly drumming against the fabric of his sleeve. Then, with uncharacteristic hesitancy, he shook his head. "That, General, is a question not so easily answered." Grant let out a short, bitter laugh. "What's wrong with the lot they're running with?" His voice was edged with frustration, but there was something else beneath it, something darker. Poirot leaned forward slightly. His voice was lower now, measured. "Tell me, General, have you noticed any changes in your daughters? Mood swings, restlessness, bursts of energy followed by unexplained exhaustion, a certain, shall we say, unsteadiness in their tempers?" The General's brows shot up. "Damn it, sir, you sound like an advertisement for some blasted patent medicine." "No, I haven't seen anything of the sort." "Then you are fortunate," Poirot said, his voice grave. There was a charged silence. Then Grant's patience snapped. He slammed a hand against the arm of his chair, his face reddening. "What the devil is the meaning of all this?" Poirot's answer came in a single word, crisp and deadly. "Drugs." The room seemed to contract, the air thickening. Grant's body stiffened, and for a moment he simply stared. "Then what?" The word exploded from him, a roar of rage and disbelief. His fists clenched, his entire body vibrating with fury. Poirot remained impassive. "An attempt is being made to lure your daughter Sheila into addiction. The cocaine habit, General, is insidious. A week, perhaps 2, is all it takes. After that the addict will pay anything, do anything, to secure more. You see, the seller of the poison makes not just a customer, but a slave." For a long moment there was no response, only the sound of the wind rattling faintly against the windows. Then, like a dam breaking, the General erupted into a flood of blasphemous rage. His curses, vivid and unrestrained, filled the room. The old soldier's hands gripped the armrests with such force that his knuckles turned white. His face was a storm of wrath, his breath coming in harsh bursts. Poirot waited. He allowed the fire to burn itself down, the violent rage to smolder into something colder, something more dangerous. At last, Grant spoke again, voice low and lethal. "When I get my hands on the filthy, rotten son of a—" Poirot raised a hand. "We have first, as your most admirable Mrs. Beeton would say, to catch the hare. When we do, I will turn him over to you with the greatest pleasure." He rose, careful in his movements, yet as he stepped back, his foot caught against an intricately carved brass table. He stumbled, righted himself with a light grasp on the General's arm and murmured, "1,000 pardons, but one thing, General, one thing above all. You must say nothing of this to your daughters." Grant's eyes flared. What? You think I'll stand by while? You will stand by, Poirot interrupted firmly. If you confront them, you will hear only lies. The general glared at him, jaw tight, fists clenched, but Poirot held his gaze unwaveringly. A long tense silence stretched between them. Then at last, Grant exhaled sharply, running a hand through his thinning white hair. "Oh, have it your own way," he growled, but the way his fingers twitched restlessly against the arm of his chair told Poirot that the old soldier was mastered, not convinced. Poirot turned, carefully weaving his way through the jungle of brass and wood, stepping over the heavy rugs and avoiding the precariously balanced Benares trays. He exited without another word. Mrs. Larkin's room was full of people, the air thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the tang of freshly mixed cocktails. At a side table, Mrs. Larkin herself was preparing drinks with an effortless grace. She was a tall woman, her pale auburn hair swept into an elegant roll at the nape of her neck. Her greenish-gray eyes gleamed, their pupils dark and wide. She moved with a slow, deliberate elegance, an almost feline ease that carried a whisper of something dangerous. She might have passed for a woman in her early 30s, but Poirot's gaze was sharp, and he did not miss the faint lines that crept from the corners of her eyes, nor the carefully concealed weariness that hinted she was older than she appeared. A brisk, no-nonsense woman, a friend of Lady Carmichael's, had shepherded Poirot into the room, pressed a cocktail into his hand, and with a subtle nod, directed him toward a girl seated by the window. She was small and fair, her complexion suspiciously angelic, cheeks pink and white, lips forming a perfect bow, but her eyes were keen, watchful. They missed nothing. Poirot lifted his glass. "To your continued good health, mademoiselle." She gave him a sharp, assessing glance before tilting her head in a nod and drinking. Then with abrupt directness she said, "You know my sister." Poirot lifted a brow. "Your sister, Pam Grant," she supplied crisply. "Ah, and where is your sister today?" Pam's mouth twisted slightly. "Out hunting. Ought to be back soon. I met her in London." Poirot's eyes glinted. "She told you?" Pam hesitated. "Not everything." A pause, then sharper. "Was Sheila in a jam?" Poirot took a measured sip of his drink. "So she did not tell you everything." Pam's jaw tightened. "Was Tony Hawker there?" Before Poirot could answer, the door swung open. The room's hum of conversation dipped briefly. Sheila Grant entered, still dressed in her hunting kit, a streak of mud marring her cheek. Beside her, a tall figure in riding clothes followed, a man with a cool expression and eyes that never seemed to stay still. Anthony Hawker. Sheila's voice was light, careless. "Hello, people. We've come in for a drink. Tony's flask is dry." Poirot murmured under his breath, "Talk of the angels." Pam Grant's voice was sharp. "Devils, you mean?" Poirot turned to her, studying her face. His voice when he spoke was quiet, but it cut through the chatter like a knife. "Is it like that?" Before Pam could answer, another figure stepped forward, Mrs. Larkin. Her lips curved into a slow, knowing smile. She held out a fresh drink to Hawker, her fingers barely brushing his as she passed it. "Here you are, Tony," she purred. "Tell me, did you draw Gallert's copse?" Poirot did not miss the way Hawker hesitated, the fraction of a second before he answered, and most of all, the way, even as he turned to Mrs. Larkin, his eyes flickered just once back to Sheila Grant. Poirot noted it all, and in that moment he knew the game had begun. The rain had begun to fall in a slow, misty drizzle as Detective Alistair Crowe stepped into the dimly lit parlour of the Ashbourne estate. A fire crackled in the grand stone hearth, its flickering glow casting restless shadows on the walls. Across the room, Charlotte Wren, young, sharp-eyed and visibly tense, stood near the window, her fingers tightening and loosening against the fabric of her sleeve. She turned abruptly when she saw him, her voice edged with something between relief and fear. "So it was you who came to the house yesterday?" Crowe nodded. "Did your father tell you?" She shook her head. "Edgar described you." "I guessed." From the corner her sister Evelyn snapped. "You went to see father." "I did." Crowe's tone was even, controlled. "We have mutual interests." Evelyn narrowed her eyes. "I don't believe that." "What exactly don't you believe?" Crowe asked mildly, watching her reaction. That wasn't your real reason for being here, she shot back, her voice laced with suspicion. She turned on Charlotte. Why aren't you saying anything? Charlotte hesitated, then asked in a quiet voice, This isn't about Donovan Pierce, is it? Crow's silence was answer enough. Charlotte's face paled. From across the room the sound of hushed voices drew his attention. By the fireplace, Donovan Pierce leaned close to their hostess, Eleanor Ashbourne. Her voice, though low, carried a thread of urgency. But I can't wait, I need it now. Crow's gaze flickered. Impatience is a dangerous thing, he murmured. Evelyn didn't smile, her hands were clenched in her lap. Something's wrong, isn't it? Charlotte's been different lately, restless, moody, and it started when she met Pierce. Crow met her gaze. Tell me, Miss Wren, have you ever taken laudanum? She recoiled slightly. No, but is that what this is about? Her voice was barely above a whisper. Charlotte, have you? Charlotte had drifted back toward them, a fresh drink trembling slightly in her grip. Her expression was unreadable. What's dangerous? She asked. Crow's voice was soft, but firm. We're speaking of poisons, the kind that steal the mind and the soul before the body even notices, the kind that turn people into something they never meant to become. Charlotte's fingers slipped on the glass, the drink sloshed onto the carpet. Crow continued, watching her carefully. Addiction is a quiet thief. It takes hold before you realize you've been robbed, and those who peddle it, who prey on the weak and the desperate, they are the real murderers. There was a long silence. Then in the faintest whisper, Charlotte murmured something. The flask. Crow turned sharply. On the ornate table near the entrance, among scattered riding gear, lay a silver hunting flask. He picked it up, running a gloved finger over the engraved initials. D.P. Pierce's flask is empty, he mused. But when he tilted it, there was no telltale slosh of liquid. Instead, something finer, something lighter, shifted within. He unscrewed the top. A small pile of fine white powder clung to the rim. Crow exhaled slowly, his expression hardening. Donovan Pierce's flask was not empty, it was full of poison. The storm rumbled low in the distance, the wind rattling the windows of Blackwood Manor, as Detective Alistair Crow fixed his gaze on the trembling figure before him. Charlotte Wren had backed against the grand oak desk, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Her eyes, wide dark pools of fear, darted between Crow and her sister Evelyn, who stood rigid beside the flickering fire. The room, once a picture of wealth and refinement, now seemed suffocating, thick with unspoken secrets and shadows that stretched ominously across the walls. You've been blind to it, Crow said, his voice as measured as a blade pressed against silk, not really knowing, perhaps not wanting to know, what it is you and your sisters have been doing. But you have been feeding, like the mares of Diomedes, on human flesh. Charlotte let out a strangled sob, pressing a trembling hand to her lips. It sounds monstrous when you put it that way, but it's true. Her voice cracked, and she turned away as if unable to face the enormity of her own words. I never realized, not until that night in London when Dr. Ashford spoke to me. He wasn't like the others, he wasn't cruel, or condemning. Just grave, sincere. That's when I saw it for what it was. Before that I thought, she hesitated, her fingers tightening on the edge of the desk. I thought it was just something thrilling, a little dangerous, but not something that really mattered. And now, Crow prompted, his keen eyes searching her face. Charlotte swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. I'll do anything you say. I'll talk to the others. A pause, then more softly. But Dr. Ashford, he won't ever forgive me, will he? On the contrary, Crow said, his tone gentler now. Both Dr. Ashford and I are prepared to help you, to give you a chance to start anew, but you must trust us, and one thing must be done. His voice hardened, his words cutting through the heavy air. One person must be destroyed, utterly, and only you and your sisters can destroy him. It is your testimony alone that will bring him to justice. Charlotte stiffened, her lips parted slightly, but no sound came. When she finally spoke, it was a whisper laced with horror. You mean my father? No, Charlotte. Crow stepped closer, his shadow looming over her. Not your father. Did I not tell you? I know everything. Your photograph was recognized in official records. You are not Charlotte Wren. His voice was quiet but unyielding, every word carrying the weight of truth. Your real name is Lillian Carter, a former runaway, arrested for theft and sent to a reformatory. When you were released, you were approached by the man who calls himself Frederick Wren. He offered you a new life, wealth, freedom, a place in high society, but in return, you had a role to play, a daughter. You and the others were part of his charade. You were his unwitting pawns, luring the innocent into his web, introducing them to his trade. Charlotte's breath hitched. She pressed her hands against her temples, as if trying to block out his words, but the truth had already taken root, unraveling the lies she had clung to for so long. This man must be exposed, Crow continued, and you must be the one to do it. A long silence stretched between them. Then at last Charlotte whispered, and after that, Crow exhaled, his sharp features softening for the briefest moment. Well, then you will be free. From across the room, Evelyn let out a low, bitter laugh. Free? After everything we've done? Crow turned to her, his expression unreadable. Freedom is not given, it is earned, and redemption begins with the truth. Evelyn looked away, her jaw clenched. Charlotte meanwhile wiped at her damp cheeks and straightened, though her hands still shook. Crow nodded once. He had planted the seed. Now it was only a matter of time before the entire house of lies came crashing down.